The hospital never truly slept. Daniel Reyes had learned this in his first week as a registered nurse on the pediatric ward at St. Matthew's Medical Center 7 years ago, when he was 24 and still naive enough to believe that competence alone would be enough to carry him through the harder nights. He knew better now. Competence got you through the technical parts, the IV insertions, the medication calculations, the careful monitoring of vitals that fluctuated like weather systems. What carried you through the harder nights was something harder to name. A kind of stubborn love, maybe. A refusal to detach completely, even when every self-preservation instinct you possessed told you that detachment was the only way to survive this job with your sanity intact. It was a Thursday evening in late October when Miriam Castillo arrived at St. Matthew's with her 3 sons, and Daniel's life changed in the way that the most important changes tend to happen, without announcement, without fanfare, through the plain and ordinary door of a hospital admission that looked, on the surface, like dozens of others he had processed that month. He was 45 minutes into a 12-hour night shift, already running behind because a child in room 7 had pulled out his IV line, and another in room 12 had spiked a fever that needed documentation and physician notification. The pediatric ward smelled the way it always did, antiseptic overlaid with something sweeter, the residue of apple juice boxes and the particular plasticky scent of children's hospital gowns. The fluorescent lights hummed their endless monotone. Daniel moved through this environment with the practiced efficiency of someone who had stopped noticing most of it, his sneakers squeaking softly on the polished floor, his dark hair slightly disheveled from where he'd run a hand through it during a stressful moment earlier in the shift. He was at the nurse's station updating a chart when the elevator opened and Miriam Castillo walked out, and the word walked was generous. She moved like someone who had been running for days and had just now, in this fluorescent-lit corridor, decided that running was no longer possible. She was a woman of perhaps 35, with dark circles beneath her eyes so profound they looked almost painted on, wearing a gray sweater that had seen better seasons, and carrying a canvas bag that bulged with what appeared to be enough supplies for a siege. Behind her came 3 boys. Daniel noticed the boys immediately, because they were impossible not to notice. Not because they were loud or disruptive, but because of the particular quality of their silence. They were identical in the way that only identical triplets can be, the same dark hair and olive skin and large, watchful eyes, but something in each of their expressions was already distinctly, irreducibly their own. The first one walked close to his mother's left side, practically attached to her hip, his eyes moving around the ward with a vigilance that looked too old for a face that couldn't have been more than 8 years old. The second walked slightly behind, and Daniel noticed immediately that his gait was uneven, a subtle but unmistakable drag in his right leg. The third was the one being pushed in the wheelchair that a nursing aide was guiding from behind, and this boy sat very still, too still, with a blanket over his lap and a slightly gray pallor to his skin that made Daniel's clinical mind begin cataloging possibilities before he'd even spoken a word to any of them. "Mrs. Castillo?" He came around the nurse's station, extending his hand. "I'm Daniel Reyes. I'm the charge nurse on tonight. We've been expecting you. Dr. Nguyen called ahead." She shook his hand, and her grip was firm despite everything, which told him something about her. "It's Ms.," she said, not harshly, just matter-of-factly, "and yes, thank you." Her voice was steady in the way that voices are when the person using them has made a deliberate and exhausting decision to keep them that way. "Of course, I'm sorry." He looked at the boys. "And these are your sons?" "Mateo, Raphael, and Elias." She gestured to each in turn, the vigilant one first, then the one with the uneven gait, then the pale boy in the wheelchair. Room 14 became its own small world within the larger world of the hospital, the way hospital rooms always do when a family settles into them for an extended stay. Miriam brought this particular quality of settledness with her. It was clearly not her first long hospitalization, and within 48 hours the room had taken on a character that was entirely the Castillo family's own. There were drawings taped to the wall above Elias's bed, made by all three boys in the family room next door during the long hours when their mother was in consultations with physicians. Raphael's drawings were the most technically accomplished, detailed architectural sketches of buildings and bridges that seemed extraordinary for an 8-year-old until you spent 5 minutes with him and understood that extraordinary was simply the baseline for Rafael Castillo. Mateo's contributions were fewer but intensely colored, abstract shapes in combinations that shouldn't have worked, but somehow did. Elias's own drawings, made during the hours when he felt well enough to sit up, were filled with animals, real and invented both, creatures with the bodies of horses and the wings of eagles, dragons that somehow looked gentle, a recurring character that appeared to be some kind of winged dog that Elias called, with complete seriousness, Captain Magnificent. "He's been drawing Captain Magnificent since he was 4, Miriam told Daniel one night, when it was past midnight and Elias was sleeping and she was sitting in the chair beside her son's bed with a cup of terrible vending machine coffee and the particular hollow eyes of a person who has given sleep a lower priority than everything else. He invented him when we first found out how serious his heart was. His therapist said it was a coping mechanism, giving himself a protector. But I think it's more than that. I think Elias is Captain Magnificent. I think it's a self-portrait." Daniel was charting at the small desk in the corner, but he was listening to everything. He had learned to chart and listen simultaneously, one of the more practically useful skills his years on the ward had developed. "He's an extraordinary kid," he said, and he meant it without qualification. "They all are," Miriam said, and the fierceness in her voice was absolute and unironic. "People hear triplets and they want to know if they're identical, and then they want to know which one is the troublemaker and which one is the smart one, as if you can divide 3 people into categories. But they're just each completely themselves." "Tell me about them," Daniel said, and it wasn't a professional prompt, it was genuine curiosity, and something in his tone made that clear, because Miriam looked at him for a moment with an evaluating expression, then seemed to decide that he deserved an honest answer. She told him that Mateo was the oldest by 4 minutes and had appointed himself guardian of his brothers from what seemed like the moment of his own birth. He was the one who had, at age 5, marched up to a kid at their preschool who was mocking Elias's cardiac monitor and told the kid with devastating kindergarten clarity that he was being cruel and that cruel people were the loneliest people in the world. He was the one who always knew when Elias was having a bad day before anyone else did, who tracked his brother's breathing and color with the unconscious vigilance of someone whose entire nervous system had oriented itself toward this one task. He was also, she added with a soft laugh, the most dramatic human being she had ever encountered, a child who expressed minor inconveniences with Shakespearean gravity, and major ones with a composure that was somehow even more striking because of the contrast. Raphael, she said, was different. Quieter, more internal, processing the world through a kind of architectural logic that organized everything into structures and systems. His cerebral palsy had been diagnosed when he was 2, a consequence of the prematurity that had defined all 3 boys' early lives. His right leg was weaker, and he'd been through years of physical therapy that he'd approached with the same methodical patience he brought to everything. He loved bridges, not as a hobby, as a passion, an obsession. He knew the names and engineering specifications of famous bridges around the world and could tell you why each one was beautiful in structural terms. He was also, Miriam said, the gentlest person she had ever known. When Elias was in pain, Raphael didn't talk. He just arrived and sat nearby and was present in a way that seemed to have a measurable physical effect, as if his brother's proximity was itself a form of medicine. And Elias. She was quiet for a moment before she talked about Elias, the way people are quiet before they say something important. Elias, she said, had been sick for his entire life and had never once seemed to think of himself as a sick person. He had the lightest spirit of anyone in the family, curious about everything, funny in an entirely natural way that wasn't performing for anyone, deeply, profoundly interested in creatures both real and imaginary. His heart was literally defective, had required 3 weeks into the Castillo family's residency on the pediatric ward, something shifted in Daniel's life outside the hospital. He had a life outside the hospital, though he sometimes forgot this in the way that people forget things that have been given insufficient attention. He had a one-bedroom apartment in the West Side neighborhood, 20 minutes from St. Matthews, furnished with the benign negligence of someone who was mostly there to sleep and occasionally to eat. He had a sister in Portland whom he called on Sundays with reasonable consistency. He had a small collection of novels he read in the 45 minutes before sleep claimed him on his days off, and a running habit he maintained with the grim dedication of someone who knew that if he stopped, he would not start again. He had, until 8 months ago, a relationship with a man named Patrick, which had ended with the quiet devastation of two people who genuinely liked each other, discovering that liking each other was not, in the end, sufficient structural support for a life built together. Patrick's primary complaint, stated with fairness and sadness, had been that Daniel was more present at the hospital than anywhere else, that his emotional investment in his patients left him at home like a phone with a drained battery, functional in basic ways but unable to sustain connection. Daniel had contested this at the time. He no longer contested it. He understood with the clarity that comes from reflection rather than defensiveness that Patrick had been describing something real, that the quality of presence he brought to the pediatric ward, the deep attention, the willingness to be moved by what was happening, the refusal to maintain professional distance at the cost of genuine human contact, was something he could not or did not replicate in his personal life. He had theorized that this was because his personal life didn't need it the way his patients did. He now suspected it was because he didn't know how to offer that quality of attention without the structure and purpose of the hospital to contain it. He was thinking about this on a Tuesday afternoon, on a rare day off, sitting in the window of a coffee shop with a novel he'd barely opened, when his phone buzzed. It was a text from Miriam Castillo, which surprised him because he had given her his personal number. Hospital policy permitted this under certain circumstances, and he'd made the call based on the practical reality that she sometimes needed information after handoff and that the nursing station's hold times were unreasonable. The text said, "Elias had a good morning. He drew Captain Magnificent fighting a giant squid. Thought you'd want to know. Mateo won a card game against a medical student, and I've never seen him happier." Daniel stared at the text for a moment. Then he started laughing, alone in a coffee shop, with a genuine, spontaneous delight he realized with some surprise he had not felt in a while. He texted back, "Tell Mateo to go easy on the medical students. They have enough problems." He hesitated, then added, "How are you?" The response came after a pause. "Tired. Hopeful, terrified, the usual. You?" He thought about Patrick's assessment. He thought about the novel he hadn't opened. He thought about the quality of attention that he apparently reserved for a hospital ward. "Same," he typed, which was more honest than he'd been with most people recently. "Get some sleep tonight if you can." "You too," she sent back, and then, "Thank you, Daniel, for actually caring. It's noticeable." He put his phone down. He looked out the window at the October street, the leaves coming down in their annual surrender, the people moving past with their coffees and their dogs and their oblivious daily lives. He thought about Elias breathing in room 14, about Raphael's bridges and Mateo's fierce card games, about Miriam's particular brand of exhausted steadfastness. He picked up his novel, but he wasn't really reading. He was thinking about what it meant to care for people, and whether the caring he had been told was a flaw might actually be the most essential thing about him, and whether there was a way to live that honored it more fully instead of treating it as a liability. He didn't reach any conclusions that afternoon, but the thinking itself felt important. Back on the ward, the days took on their own rhythm. Elias had good days, when his oxygen saturation held steady in acceptable ranges, and he sat up in bed with his drawings and his commentary on the world, which was invariably perceptive and frequently hilarious. On a good day, Elias was the kind of company that made you understand viscerally why people talk about the life force. There was simply more of it in him than physics could quite account for, concentrated in a body that was simultaneously fragile and luminous. He told Daniel about the creatures he invented, explaining their ecosystems and habits with the confident specificity of a natural historian. Captain Magnificent, he explained, was not actually a dog, but a creature that had evolved from dogs over 10,000 years on a planet where the primary predators flew.
The call came on a Friday night, during Daniel's shift, 6 weeks after the Castillo family's arrival. He was at the nurse's station when the transplant coordinator's name appeared on his phone screen, and his heart performed the specific lurch it always performed in these moments, the one that contained an entire universe of contradictory feelings, because a transplant call was the best news, and also carried within it the darkest possible shadow. Somewhere, someone had died. A family had said yes in the midst of unspeakable grief. The heart that might save Elias Castillo's life existed because another child's life had ended, and this was the terrible mathematics of transplantation that nobody who worked in this field was ever fully at peace with. He passed the call to the attending physician immediately and then stood for a moment in the corridor, breathing deliberately before walking to room 14. Miriam was awake. She was always awake when something was happening, as if her nervous system had calibrated itself to the ward's rhythms. She looked up when Daniel came in, and she read something in his face, and her own face did something complicated, hope and terror arriving simultaneously, which is one of the stranger expressions a human face can hold. "There may be a heart," he said quietly, looking first at Elias, who was asleep. "The team is evaluating the match now. It's preliminary, I need you to understand that. And there are tests and processes before we know anything definitively. But I wanted you to hear it from me before anyone else, and I wanted you to have a moment before the official conversations begin." Miriam put her hand over her mouth. She sat very still for 10 full seconds. Then she took her hand away and looked at Elias with an expression that was so purely itself, so completely beyond the management and containment that she'd been performing for weeks, that Daniel had to make the conscious effort to remain professionally present rather than to be simply moved. "Should I wake him?" she asked. "I'd wait," Daniel said gently, "until we know more. Let him sleep." She nodded. She looked at Daniel. "How are the odds?" "Better than they've been," he said, which was honest and incomplete and the best answer he could give without the information that wasn't yet available. She nodded again. Then she said, in a voice that had gone very quiet, "What about the family, the donor's family?" "They made an extraordinary decision," Daniel said, "in the worst moment of their lives." Miriam closed her eyes. When she opened them, there were tears on her face that she didn't move to wipe away. "I pray for them every night," she said. "Even before this, I pray for the family of whoever it will be. Is that terrible? I don't know if it's terrible." "It's not terrible," Daniel said. "It's generous." She looked at him, and in the particular quality of that look, the one between two people who have shared something intense enough to strip away social performance, she said, "You're going to be okay, you know, after this, whatever happens." He blinked. Of all the things he'd expected her to say. "I'm worried about Elias," he said, "not about me." "You can worry about both," Miriam said. "I've been watching you for 6 weeks, Daniel. You carry every patient in this ward. That's not a criticism, but someone should notice." She paused. "So, I'm noticing." He didn't know what to say to that, so he said the truthful thing. "Thank you." He left to continue his shift and spent the next 3 hours moving through his duties with the particular heightened awareness that preceded major events on the ward. Everything a little brighter, every detail more distinct. He checked on the other children in his care, he updated charts, he spoke to the physicians who were conducting the match evaluation by phone, contributing what nursing information he had, and he kept coming back to the corridor outside room 14, not going in, just standing for a moment in the way that the body stands near the things it cares about. At 2 in the morning, when Mateo appeared in the corridor, because of course Mateo appeared, Mateo, who was constitutionally incapable of sleeping when anything was happening, Daniel sat down with him on the bench outside the family room and told him carefully that there might be news soon, that it was
Elias Castillo spent 3 weeks in the ICU and then 6 more weeks on the pediatric ward before he was well enough to be discharged, and those 9 weeks were their own particular education in the complexity of recovery, which is not, as the movies suggest, a single triumphant moment, but a long and irregular process full of setbacks and incremental victories, and days that look like regression before they turn out to be progress. There were the weeks of immunosuppression management, because a transplanted heart is a foreign organ, and the body's default impulse is to reject it, and preventing rejection requires medications that suppress the immune system and introduce their own complications. There were the infection scares, one of which was serious enough to require its own intensive treatment, and which put Miriam back in the chair beside Elias's bed with the same exhausted vigilance Daniel had first observed 10 weeks earlier. There was a week where Elias's energy was so low that he barely touched his drawings, and this was, somehow, harder to witness than the medical crises, because the absence of Captain Magnificent from the papers beside his bed was its own kind of indicator. But then there was the day, a Thursday morning in January, 3 months after his arrival at St. Matthew's, when Daniel came into room 14 for morning rounds and found Elias sitting up in bed with his sketchbook open, drawing with a concentration so complete that he didn't look up when Daniel entered. On the page was Captain Magnificent, larger and more detailed than Daniel had seen him before, wings fully extended, and this version of the creature had a new quality that the earlier drawings hadn't had. There was something in his posture, in the set of his wings, that suggested not just the possibility of flight, but the actual, current, joyful act of it. "That's a new one," Daniel said. Elias looked up. His color was better. His eyes were brighter. The gray tinge to his skin had been replaced by something more pink, more alive, the external evidence of what the new heart was doing internally, circulating blood more effectively, oxygenating tissues that had been chronically underfed. "He can fly now," Elias said, in a tone that treated this as obvious and significant in equal measure. "He couldn't before?" "He could," Elias said carefully, "but he was always tired. Now he's not." Daniel looked at the drawing for a moment. Then he looked at Elias. Then he had to look away at the wall for a second, because he was a professional nurse in a clinical setting, and the particular feeling that the drawing had produced in him was not compatible with professional composure. He collected himself and looked back. "He looks good," he said. "He feels good," Elias said, and there was no ambiguity about who he was talking about. The discharge day arrived in February, when the weather had turned cold and clear, and the sky outside the hospital windows was the particular blue of winter days that are genuinely bright rather than merely sunny. Miriam packed the canvas bag, much more battered now than when she'd arrived, and the drawings came down from the wall, each one carefully rolled and stored. The boys wore their regular clothes rather than hospital clothes, which produced in each of them a subtle but visible shift in bearing, as if the ordinary textures of jeans and sneakers were themselves a form of information about what was normal and possible. Daniel was on day shift for the first time in weeks. He had traded with a colleague specifically for this, though he didn't say so explicitly to anyone. He was at the nurses' station when the Castillo family came out of room 14 for the last time, and Miriam saw him, and her face did the thing it did when she was choosing between several possible responses and settling on the honest one. "You're here," she said. "I'm always here," he said. She laughed, a real, exhausted, genuinely amused laugh. "That's the problem," she said, and then, differently, "Thank you, Daniel, for everything. All of it. The information, and the card games, and the bridge printouts, and the honesty, and just thank you. It was my job," he said, which was true, and then, "It was also more than my job," which was also true, and which he said because she deserved both truths and not just the professional one. She nodded. She looked at him for a moment, and there was something in the look that was more complex than gratitude. It was recognition, the kind between people who have seen each other in extreme moments and therefore know something real about who each other is. "You should let people take care of you sometimes," she said. "You're very good at receiving information about others, and not so good at being known yourself. The boys know you, actually, better than you might think." Before he could respond, Matteo materialized at his elbow with the abruptness that Matteo brought to most physical arrivals. He was holding something, a piece of paper, folded into a careful rectangle. He held it out to Daniel with the formal ceremony of an official document being transferred between heads of state. He took it and unfolded it. It was a drawing, and he recognized immediately who had made which parts. Matteo's colors, fierce and abstract and somehow exactly right. Raphael's precise structural lines in the background.